Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Andrew,
And I'm Rachel.
and you are listening to Picture the Scene podcast, a true crime podcast aiming to put you, the listener, at the scene of the crime. Now, we are true crime podcasts, so as always, listener caution is always advised. Now, Rach, how is life in the world of Rach?
Really well, thank you. It's we're on the cusp of spring, aren't we? Or in fact, I think we're in spring. We're in spring. On the
Yeah,
cusp of summer.
we are.
Still catching up. Can't believe how lovely the weather's turning. Yeah, there's a spring in my step. How are you?
I am great, thank you very much. It's been a good week. Busy but productive week at work, so I can't complain. And we're recording. I get to chat to you about true crime, so life is always good when that happens.
Even better.
So, before we get into it, though, everyone, and don't worry, this is not going to be a 20-minute intro. If you've got thoughts on today's episode, come find us and let us know. We do read everything, and honestly, hearing what you make of these cases is one of the best bits of doing this, isn't it, Rach?
Absolutely. Love hearing from the listeners. Gives us a boost to keep on going.
And the viewers, actually. We had a comment yesterday on Spotify saying that they watched us and we remind them of seeing red.
What a compliment.
Yes, indeed. So I also want to give a quick shameless plug to Jack and Phoebe, who have been keeping me entertained over the last few months with their content. So if you search for Just Jack TV on social medias and also on YouTube, they're trying to grow their YouTube channel. I'm going to link to their accounts in the show notes. You're going to find some humorous, honest, and entertaining reviews of food establishments, hotels, and Jack inexplicably struggling to identify vegetables. Now, it's harmless, entertaining fun, and it's a nice palate cleanser against the murder and crime that we generally look at from a day to day.
Everyone needs that, right? Especially, like, I don't know whether you find, like, I absolutely love true crime shows, love podcasts, love absorbing documentaries on television too. But you absolutely need that moment away, that break, don't you? Every couple of episodes, right? I want something that's going to warm my heart now. So that sounds
Yes.
great. I'm definitely going to go and take a look at Jack and Phoebe.
Yeah, it's not actually an advert, this. They don't know I'm doing this. It's just I love them. And it's just so funny because, like, every now and again, Phoebe will just drop an inappropriate comment in that Jack never notices, so it always stays in. And, like, they do, like, hotel things and they take a little blue light so you can see all the stains on the mattress
Gosh,
and the
maybe
walls
not.
and sometimes the ceiling as well. But
Oh no.
but the food reviews are good, though. And the hotel reviews are good. I'm not knocking them. But anyway, let's get into the case, because we do get people always telling us that we talk too long at the beginning. So,
Sorry.
now today's case is an unusual one, everyone. It's not a whodunit. I'm not going to keep you guessing. We're going to know from very early on who started the fire. And honestly, by the end of the episode, the Court of Appeal are going to tell us they're sure that he did it as well. So that's not the mystery. The mystery is, if you can call it that, it's something else entirely. It's whether a man who wasn't mentally fit to stand trial should ever be tried in the first place, and what on earth the system is supposed to do with him when everyone agrees that leaving him to his own devices is dangerous, but nobody, and I mean nobody, not the hospitals, not the probation service, not the local council, not the police, are willing or able to take responsibility for him. So
Wow,
this is
it's
a
going to be a
case.
hard case for a Friday morning.
Yeah, it's pretty long as well, but this is a case where by the end of it, you're probably going to feel like the system failed everyone here. The man himself, his 92-year-old neighbour with dementia who was living right next door, the fire officers who kept getting called out, the jury who convicted him, the judges who had to try and put it right 7 years later. There's no winner here. There's just a set of problems that don't have a clean answer. So with that, Rach, are you ready for some true crime?
If you'd have asked me a few minutes before that intro, I'd have been saying absolutely, but I'm a bit scared now that it's going to be a really savage case. Yes, I'm ready to listen to this one, Andrew, tentatively.
So if it's safe for you to do so, I'd like you to sit back, relax, close your eyes, and picture the scene. It's the 3rd of April, 2018, in Sheffield, South Yorkshire. And for anyone who doesn't know it, apart from being my home city, it's the 4th largest city in England by population, sitting right on the edge of the Peak District in the north of the country. It's about 160 miles north of London and roughly 40 miles east of Manchester. It's a city built on steel, famous for its 7 hills. It's got a population of just over 500,000 people, and it's the kind of place that's properly northern. It's friendly, it's got working class roots, it's a bit battered by the decline of heavy industry, but it's still very much alive. So the weather in Sheffield that day was what you'd expect for early April in the north of England. The temperature was sitting at around 9 degrees Celsius, that's around 48 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's cool but not cold. There'd been a bit of cloud cover through the morning, slight breeze, nothing remarkable. The kind of day where you'd pop a jumper on under your coat and then just not think twice about it. Now, sunrise had been just before 6:30 in the morning, so by the time our story really kicks off, it was full daylight, an ordinary Tuesday, people going about their business. We're focusing on an end-of-terrace semi-detached bungalow on a residential street in Sheffield. It's a sort of property that you'd find in any city in England. Modest, single story, a little bit of a garden, the kind of place a council tenant might live in on their own. Now, it is rented from the Sheffield City Council, and it's been the home of a 52-year-old man named David Wood for around 2 years by this point. Now, next door, and I want you to hold on to this detail, because it may not make sense at the start, but it will eventually. So keep it in your mind, listeners. It's a 92-year-old woman with dementia. So that's 92 with dementia in a semi-detached property by herself. And so
Wow.
because it was semi-detached, she was sharing a wall with David Wood. Now, she couldn't easily leave her home on her own. She'd need help getting out in an emergency. And the two properties, being semi-detached, they shared a roof space. So anything that happened in one house could potentially spread to the other. So on a particular Tuesday, at some point during the morning, passers-by on a busy road outside noticed smoke coming from David's bungalow. So they did what anyone else would do. They called the emergency services. The fire brigade arrived, assessed the scene, and quickly worked out there was somebody inside. The front door was locked. The firefighters, equipped with breathing apparatus, forced their way in. And in the living room, slumped unconscious in an armchair, they found David Wood. So he was rushed to the hospital and placed in an induced coma. He received a full alcohol detox. He was transferred from intensive care to another ward for ongoing delirium. And as his condition improved, he became verbally and physically aggressive with the hospital staff. So much so rage that they had to detain him under what's called a deprivation of liberty order just to keep him safe and to keep them safe as well. And so that's where we're going to leave him for a minute though, because to understand how we got to a man unconscious in an armchair in a burning bungalow, we need to go back to who David Wood was, to how he ended up in that bungalow on his own, and back to a string of incidents that led up to this particular morning. Because this fire on the 3rd of April 2018 wasn't the first fire, wasn't even close to the first fire. So the question is, who is David Wood? Well, David was born in, well, we actually don't know the exact his date of birth, but by the time of the fire in April 2018, he was 52 years old. So that puts his birth somewhere around 1965 or 1966. And from very early on in his life, David had a problem. Not a criminal problem, not a behavioural problem, a medical problem. 1970, when David would have been around 4 or 5 years old, he was diagnosed with a disorder of speech and language. Now, the clinical term is dyspraxic speech with a secondary stammer. And what that means in plain English for us all is that his brain has always struggled to coordinate the muscles needed for speaking clearly. The clarity and production of his speech is severely impaired. Sometimes it's genuinely difficult to understand what he said, even when he repeats himself. So even if he repeats himself 2 or 3 times, people could struggle to understand him. So for most of his life, when words have failed him verbally, David had to resort to writing things down to communicate. Now just sit with that for a second, please, people. Imagine growing up in the 1970s in England, in the north of England, with a speech impediment so severe that people can't understand you when you talk. So imagine going to school as a child with that. Imagine trying to, because they didn't have different classes back then. Imagine trying to make friends with that. Imagine trying to hold down a job, a relationship, or a conversation in a pub with that. Because David had to live his whole life with that condition. Do you think you could do that, Rach?
I actually went to school with somebody with a severe speech impediment, and we learned from very early on that it was really rude, like of an age where you could learn that kind of behavior, but that it was very rude to try and help them finish their sentences. And So I absolutely remember sympathizing with that person so greatly, thinking how lucky I was that I didn't struggle to get my words across, because there were always moments where, and like, especially in a class environment, the teacher calls out, like, who wants to, do something? And I'm one of those people, I'm just very eager to help. It's very simple and easy for me to go, oh, such and such wants to help. But like, yeah, I had to learn to let them like speak for themselves, and for everyone to have the patience for them to have that moment as well. And yeah, difficult, absolutely, for me, but my goodness, I could not imagine the difficulty that they were going through at that time. And kids are cruel as well. Like, luckily we were in a
Yeah.
super small school, and, we didn't really have the impact of like bullying the way that, I hear and experience with my own children nowadays, things that they come home, tell me about what's going on in class. But yeah, kids can be cruel. So I really feel for him.
So somewhere in his early 20s, David found something that helped rage, or at least something that felt like it helped at the time, and that was alcohol. So by 1987, when David would have been about 21 or 22 years old, he was formally diagnosed with alcohol dependence syndrome. So we're not talking here about someone who likes a few drinks on a Friday night. We're talking about a full-blown, medically recognized dependency. And once that dependency takes hold, it doesn't let go. So David would battle alcohol for the rest of his life. So by the time we get to the events of 2018, one of the psychiatrists who assessed him would know that in the lead up to his arrest, David had been drinking a bottle of vodka a day. Just imagine that, a whole bottle of vodka every single day.
And again, like, I grew up with like living close by to a lady that was just, we were told from an early age, she's an alcoholic, just leave her alone. Like, she doesn't mean to say mean things when she walks past. And she'd make 2 trips a day. One trip, you'd see her twice a day. First trip out was to catch the bus to go and buy the booze. And then the trip back, she'd be drinking the booze on the way back to her house. And incredibly sad story, but she was so aggressive and so hostile. And, we'd be playing in the streets like 5, 6, 7, 8 kind of age. And, she'd say some awful words, but it was completely like beyond her control. She was in a different place, on a different planet. Like, to her, we weren't like innocent children playing. We were bothering her, making loud noise in her world. And yeah, I remember as I got older just thinking like, and when you get to the age of like 18, 19, and you start like enjoying going out drinking a lot, like next day you have a hangover, you don't even want to see the sight of alcohol, do you? But the people that have this addiction, this like need to have it and to survive on it, I cannot imagine how that must feel, to want to drink that much.
Interesting that you say that, actually, how she was with you, because maybe what I'm about to say might explain it a little bit. And this is just people, we haven't scripted this. I didn't know Rachel was going to say that, but psychiatrists who assessed David over the years have concluded that this long-standing, decades-long alcohol dependency has caused what's called an organic personality change. And what that means is that the alcohol has actually physically changed the way his brain works. So it's left him unable to plan properly, unable to organize himself, and unable to think through the consequences of his actions. He struggles to respond flexibly to different situations, and when he gets frustrated, he can't regulate his emotions the way most of us can. So that wasn't a character flaw, that was actual physical brain damage caused by decades of chronic alcohol abuse. So you never know, that could have been similar with the lady you was talking about.
Yeah, and this is like, what, 40 years of alcohol abuse? From a very early age, he was drinking, like early 20s, he was drinking excessive amounts, right? And
In
by
his
the
20s, he was
time,
already an alcoholic, yeah.
yeah, and by the time he was 60s, or in his 60s, 40 years later, he was on a bottle of vodka a day. Absolutely no judgment here. That blows my mind, like.
But in 2015, so 3 years before this incident, it's got significantly worse, so Rach. So in 2015, David, while intoxicated, he had a fall. And it wasn't a minor fall. He suffered a traumatic head injury, and the medical records describe a basal skull fracture, frontal, subdural, and subarachnoid hemorrhage, and gliosis in the frontal lobe. Now, I'm not a medical professional, but I've done my reading, so I want to translate this for you if that's okay,
Yes, please.
because I didn't have a clue when I first read that.
Yeah.
So, a basal skull fracture is a break at the base of the skull, at the back of the skull, and it's one of the most serious head injuries you can have. And a subdural hemorrhage is bleeding between the brain and the tissue that covers it. And a subarachnoid hemorrhage is bleeding in the space around the brain itself. And gliosis in the frontal lobe means there's permanent scarring to the front part of the brain, and that front part of the brain is the bit that controls decision making, impulse control, personality, and judgment. So you have to think. So he he already had a change in the brain due to the alcohol dependency, and then he had this, which changes decision making, impulse control, personality, and judgment as well.
How did he suffer that injury? Just had a fall?
He fell down when he was drunk. Yeah.
Wow. Like life-changing injury from a simple fall, right?
Yeah. So David survived that, but he came out of that fall with something called dis executive syndrome. And this is a term that you're going to hear a lot in this episode, so I want to explain it properly, and I can't even pronounce it, so bear with me. Executive syndrome is a diagnosis used to describe disorders of mental functioning that are caused by brain damage rather than by things like depression or schizophrenia. Now, it causes difficulties with planning, organizing, and managing different tasks. It causes mood instability. It causes disinhibition, so it means you act before you think, and it causes problems with judgment. And it also causes significant defects in both short-term and long-term memory. So it's also, and this is important for later again, it causes something called confabulation. So that's where the brain fills in gaps in memory by making things up without the person even realizing that they're doing it. So David's confabulation, for example, included him telling people he had a daughter and he doesn't have any children. He has never had any children. But as far as he was concerned, in his head, he did have a daughter.
You're joking me.
Yeah. He'd also described a female neighbour who helped him out from time to time as his partner. And she wasn't his partner, she was just a kind neighbour. But
Yeah.
David in his mind genuinely believed that she was. And because it was a physical damage to his brain, not a mental thing, he couldn't take medication for this. He couldn't change it with medication or therapy. That he genuinely believed that was the case. So that was a dissociative syndrome talking. So it wasn't him lying. Sorry.
And you're going to anger people when they find out why you've lied without the knowledge that you have a brain condition. You're going to really anger people. You know, why would somebody lie about having a daughter or being in a relationship with this lady? Like, that's going to really piss people off, isn't it?
Yeah. But he wasn't lying though, Rach.
No,
Because
no,
in his
not in
head,
his
he
head.
was telling the truth. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was just his damaged brain trying to make sense of a world it can no longer process.
Gosh.
So by the time we get to 2018, David Wood is a man carrying an enormous amount on his shoulders. He has a severe lifelong speech impediment. He has a 30-year alcohol dependency that's rewired his brain. He's got a traumatic brain injury on top of that, which has left him with dissociative syndrome. And he's living alone in a council bungalow on a busy road in Sheffield. And the picture of somebody coping, it's really not the picture that's being painted here. From around 2001 onwards, David started accruing convictions. Nothing massive at first, mostly public order stuff, the kind of thing that suggests a man who is struggling, getting into trouble, coming to the attention of police in fairly minor ways. But from 2004 onwards, something shifted. David started making nuisance calls to the emergency services. After his head injury in 2015, these calls became a lot more frequent.
Oh my goodness. And what must have triggered a nuisance call to begin? Like, I often wonder when, and I know that then it would never be in David's mind that he was being a nuisance, but it would almost at what point does that become a part of his day and his lifeline? You know, I'm going to call 999 now and see what I can get away with. Like, yeah, I've always just wondered how that behavior begins. Is there a serious 999 call because, you know, you need something, and then the next day maybe you realised, oh, it was really nice being cared for by that operative on the line yesterday. I'll call again and see if I can speak to them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
How it all
yeah.
begins, how it all starts. Because there's no
I
malice
think
in it, is there?
no, I think for David we may never know, but that's interesting. Maybe it was just about connection
Yeah,
and being able to speak to someone. But we honestly, that's just me guessing there, people. I'm not
yeah.
saying that, but we don't know. But between the 1st of September 2016 and the 3rd of April 2018, which is the date of our fire, David Wood made 38 nuisance calls to the South Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service. So that's 38 in 18 months. And in each of these calls, he threatened to set fire to his property. And each of these 38 calls resulted in a fire engine being sent out to his address. And that's just the calls that triggered a deployment. There were more calls logged in the system that didn't result in anyone being sent. So there's a lot more than 38, but 38 when it caused enough for a fire engine to be called out.
Well, they have to go. You know, God forbid they think, oh, it's that guy again. He's winding us up, and there is something serious. Like, they have to go, don't they?
Yes. Yes, definitely. So if you were a firefighter in South Yorkshire in 2017, you know David Wood, you know the address, you know the voice, you know what the call out is going to be for, but you've got to go anyway, like you say, because one day one of those calls won't be a false alarm. And that day nearly came on the 7th of February 2017. On that day, David did what he'd been threatening to do for years. He phoned the police. He told him he was going to set fire to his home. He told him specifically that he was going to set fire to his curtains. And this time, when the police officers turned up at his house, they found him heavily intoxicated. And while they were standing there in his living room, so while the police were in his living room, do you remember his inhibition, lack of inhibition? He took out a lighter, he clicked it, and he held the flame to his living room curtains. He was trying to set them on fire. So the officers did what you'd expect them to do. They grabbed a lighter off him and they arrested him. So David pleaded guilty to attempted arson, and on the 7th of June 2017, he was sentenced to 14 months in prison, which was suspended for 2 years. So there was originally a rehabilitation activity requirement attached to that sentence,
Yeah.
which is a kind of thing designed to get someone like David actual help.
Yeah.
So it could be counselling, support, intervention, that type of thing. But he breached that requirement. So probation brought him back to court. A district judge activated the suspended sentence, which would have sent him to prison. But David appealed to the Crown Court, and on the 2nd of March 2018, the Crown Court said no, the suspended sentence could continue, but they removed the rehabilitation activity requirement altogether. So by March 20,
What was the purpose in doing that?
maybe they just thought he was, I don't know, we don't get records, but maybe they just thought,
No.
well, he's not going to do it, and he's not worth sending to prison, so we'll just take it away so he can't breach it. I don't
And
know.
that's the other thing. Like, I was about to ask if he'd have been sent to prison, how do you can't just cut him off dry on the alcohol front. Like, how do you even cope with that in a prison setting? Like,
Very
but
badly.
obviously he never got there, so it's not a question that needs to be answered. But there's so many implications to whatever path that he would need to take.
Yeah, exactly. So by March 2018, and we're getting to the fire now, David Wood is walking around Sheffield in a bungalow on his own with a suspended prison sentence hanging over his head. He's got a history of trying to set his curtains on fire. He's got a traumatic brain injury, severe alcohol dependence, executive syndrome, and no requirement now to engage with any rehabilitation services at all. And just over a month later, the fire brigade would be pulling him out of an armchair in a burning bungalow. So I want to talk, though, before we get to the fire, I want to talk about the 1st of April 2018, because this is 2 days before our fire. And it's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary piece of context for what happened. That you really couldn't believe this was real unless I know this happened. On the 1st of April, the fire service were called out to David's address, and the fire officer who responded that day was a man called Martin Ridge. And Martin Ridge had been to David's bungalow on 6 previous occasions, roughly, all in response to false reports of fire. So he knew the score. He knew David by now. He knew the address. So Mr. Ridge arrived, and David opened the back door to let him in. Now, he appeared sober that day, confused and upset. So Mr. Ridge went into the living room with him. And as they were talking, they were trying to work out what was going on when David reached into his pocket. He pulled out a plastic lighter, he clicked it, he produced a flame, and he held it to a curtain that was lying across the back of the sofa. Now, Martin Ridge, to his enormous credit, reacted instantly. He knocked David's hand away from the curtain so it wouldn't catch fire. But here's the bit that really gets me, Rach, and I think it will you too. David didn't stop here. He didn't sit down sheepishly and apologise. He went straight to the other curtain, the one hanging on the side of the window, and he tried to set light to that one as well. Now, Mr. Ridge stopped him again. He sat him down. He went outside to radio the fire and rescue control room to get some help because he was by himself. And while Martin Ridge was outside trying to get back up, David Wood walked over to the back door. He locked it. He went straight back to trying to set fire to the curtains.
Oh my God.
So I know, so Mr. Ridge, Martin Ridge, by now, could see him doing it through the window, but the door was locked. So he shouted at David to stop. He shouted at him to come and open the door, and David just ignored him. So Martin with a colleague, sorry, not by himself, but there was just the two of them. They forced entry into the property. They knocked the lighter out of David's hand for the third time, and this time they sat with him until the police arrived. So luckily no curtain had caught fire. Nobody had been hurt. But just think about that for a moment, Rach. A fire officer, a man whose entire job is preventing fires, had to physically stop David Wood from starting a fire on 3 separate occasions in a space of about 10 minutes in his own
Yeah.
living room, and the fire officer was just standing right there. So David didn't let that stop him.
No, he's determined, isn't he? And like all of these instances with the policeman, with the fire brigade, no doubt with other emergency services workers, must be incredibly frustrating knowing that this man, these are cries for help, essentially. You know, they're not, it's not coming from malice. He's incapable of making sound decisions, is he? And for them not to be able to put in place the resources that get him the help he needs so that he can live maybe in sheltered accommodation where he has more people, more eyes on him to be looked after. And on the flip side of it, if David has any moments of lucid, you know, where, you know, he's able to think clearly and recall like what's happening, he's just going to think no one cares because they don't. He just keeps on slipping through cracks or getting away with things that, like, he's not intentionally getting away with them. People are letting him off because of the state of play, but he should be being looked after, shouldn't he?
Yeah, and here's what I can't get past, Rach. So this was the 1st of April, remember? So on the 1st of April, by now, everybody knew. The fire service knew, the police knew, Sheffield City Council, who owned a bungalow, knew. They were informed. Remember, David had a life suspended sentence for attempted arson.
Yeah.
And he just tried to commit arson again in front of a fire officer. So it's not like there's any doubt.
No.
There was a witness. He was mentally unwell.
When he's got a neighbour next door to him, a frail 92-year-old woman, would you take any chances on keeping him in that accommodation, knowing what you know? Like, I know it was only 2 days, before the fire, but surely that message didn't sit in someone's inbox for any longer. You know, someone must have read and understood there was a high risk here.
You're right about his neighbour, but also he was arrested on that day, on the 1st of April, by the police, who would have had to put his details in the system when they arrested him and took him to the police station. So they would have seen he had a life suspended sentence for arson, and he just basically breached that suspended sentence. The police knew about that. So there's no like, oh yeah, maybe the message didn't get across. It would have literally been in their system. So 2 days later, on the 3rd of April, 2018, as I mentioned earlier, the fire brigade were called back to the same address. Only this time, it wasn't a false alarm. This time, when the fire officers arrived, the bungalow was actually on fire. So passers-by on the busy road outside had spotted the smoke. They downed 999. By the time the fire brigade arrived and assessed the scene, it worked out that somebody was inside. The front door was locked, the back door was locked, every window was closed and locked. So firefighters in breathing apparatus forced the front door, went into the living room, and found David Wood unconscious in his armchair. So they got him out, as I mentioned earlier. They took him to the hospital. He was placed in an induced coma. He received an emergency alcohol detox, because his body had become so dependent on alcohol that suddenly being without it was in itself a medical emergency. It could kill him. He was transferred from intensive care to another ward where the doctors described him as ongoing delirium. And I know I mentioned this earlier, but it's worth repeating. As he started to come around and as his condition started to improve, he became verbally and physically aggressive with the hospital staff, and they put him under that deprivation of liberty order. That was just to stop him from leaving the hospital or from hurting anyone else. So what I didn't mention earlier is when David was in hospital, he was seen by a consultant psychiatrist, Dr. Shetty. And Dr. Shetty's notes from the 9th of May 2018 really striking, mate. Dr. Shetty said it was difficult to do a full assessment of David's current psychiatric and cognitive state because he had neither the motivation nor the emotional ability to cooperate with long conversations or probing questions. Dr. Shetty noted that David should be treated as someone with a head injury, dissociative syndrome, and alcohol dependence syndrome. And Dr. Shetty found that David had no insight at all into his own difficulties. He just wasn't aware of the difficulties he had. And at that point, in May of 2018, the consultant psychiatrist who examined him didn't even think that David had the capacity to make decisions about where he should be discharged to and what his care should need to look like. Dr. Shetty made various recommendations for appropriate agencies to intervene. And I want to be really clear about that. So there was a consultant psychiatrist having assessed David in May of 2018 was saying that this man needs specialist support. He cannot make decisions about his own care. He has a serious brain injury. He has executive syndrome. He is alcohol dependent, and he has no insight into any of that. He doesn't know about any of these things.
No.
So David was finally discharged from hospital on the 16th of May 2018, and he was arrested on the following day, 17th of May, in connection with the fire. In the police interview with his solicitor and an appropriate adult present, he gave a no comment interview and he was remanded into custody. And from that point, he was in the criminal justice system heading towards a trial. So before we get to the fire itself, I just want to flag one more thing because this evidence is going to matter later on. When the fire experts came in and examined the scene at the bungalow, they concluded that the fire had been started deliberately. The seat of the fire was a curtain that had been draped over the back of the sofa, exactly the same setup as the 1st of April when Martin Midge had stopped it 3 times. The curtain, once lit, would have acted like a wick, like in a candle, feeding a sustained flame onto the sofa. The skirting board behind the sofa was charred in a pattern consistent with burning material dropping down behind it. Both fire experts who looked at the scene independently rejected the idea that the fire had been caused accidentally, either by a dodgy phone charger or an electrical fault. The socket in question was at the opposite end of the sofa from where the fire had started, and the damage to the socket itself, as one of the experts had said, had come from heat applied from the outside, not from inside the socket failing. And as for this to others, one of the experts, Claire Duke, put forward 2 possible scenarios for what would have happened if the fire hadn't been spotted in time. The first was that the fire might have spread to the next door property via the shared roof space. Now, she thought that was probably unlikely because the house is on a busy road and someone would have spotted it pretty quickly, which is exactly what happened actually, Rachel. And the second scenario was that the fire might have just burnt itself out because David had closed all the windows and doors and eventually the oxygen in the room would have been used up. And so in that second scenario, it wouldn't have affected the neighbour next door, the elderly woman with dementia, but it would have posed a serious risk to any firefighter who went inside to try to rescue David. So that's what we've got here, Rach. We've got a fire that was definitely started on purpose. A man pulled unconscious from his own burning home. A 92-year-old woman with dementia on the other side of a semi-detached wall. And the prosecution getting ready to charge David Wood with arson, being reckless as to whether life was endangered. So that's basically where the 92-year-old neighbour came in because it was arson where life could be endangered because the life was a next-door neighbour.
Yeah.
So now the really, really difficult bit starts here, H, because if you've all been listening carefully, I know I've been talking for a long time here, you already be asking a question that the justice system was about to grapple with unsuccessfully for the next 7 years. And that is, how on earth do you put this man on trial? So now I need to talk about the trial because they did put him on trial. So let's talk about the trial. And specifically, let's talk about how a man with a traumatic brain injury, dissociative syndrome, alcohol dependence, severe alcohol dependence, and a speech impediment so bad that people couldn't understand him when taught, ended up in Crown Court on the stand trying to defend himself against an arson charge in front of a jury. So David's trial was originally listed for the 17th of October 2018, and as that date got closer, his own legal team started raising serious questions. His solicitor said she couldn't even get proof of evidence out of him. So for those that don't know, proof of evidence is a basic document you need to run a defense, and she couldn't get it because every time she tried, David gave her a different version of events. First, he said there hadn't been a fire at all. Then, he said there had been a fire, but he wasn't there when it started. Then, he said that he wasn't the person the firefighters had rescued from the armchair. Now remember, because of his executive syndrome, a man who's with a brain injury like that can cause confabulation. So every time he said something different, that's what he believed actually happened.
Yeah,
Because
and
his brain,
and as the lawyer, like, surely she's got the paperwork and the hospital reports that allude to all of that. So that should be your line of defense. Like, we shouldn't be here because I can't even get the report out of him, let alone, trying to think about putting him up there and like trying to defend himself.
exactly, and because his brain was genuinely trying to fill in gaps with whatever made sense to him at that time, he was being honest. But then he couldn't
Whilst
remember.
also battling like alcoholism, which alters your perception of time, events, etc. Anyway, so like there's so many factors up against him.
His solicitor was trying to do her job, was trying to prepare a legal defense, and she couldn't because he gave a different story at every meeting. So on the 13th of September 2018, his defense lodged a certificate with the court saying that the case wasn't trial ready. It raised specific concerns about David's fitness to take part in the trial. His solicitor said he'd initially refused to cooperate with a psychiatrist, and a recent assessment from the prison social worker had flagged multiple concerns. The view, in her own words, was that he was not fit to instruct in any detail, that he would not be able to take part in the trial, and that even if she could get two psychiatrists to see him, she wasn't sure that he'd cooperate. So she'd asked for the case to be listed for mentions. The defence counsel, when the case came up for mention on the 12th of October, told His Honour Judge Kelson, QC, that he would assist the appellant if he had an intermediary at trial. So an intermediary, for anyone who doesn't know, is a trained specialist who sits with a vulnerable defendant or witness, and it helps them understand questions, it helps them formulate answers, and it helps them follow procedures.
Like an appropriate adult would in a police interview.
Yes. So for someone who can't communicate like David easily, an intermediary, it's not just a nice to have, it's an essential
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
a court trial. So the judge was told this, and despite being told it, no ground rules hearing was directed, which is a hearing you'd normally have to decide how an intermediary is going to work. So
And do you think that's the judge letting the process down, or do you think that's the process letting the judge down?
I think it's both. Should have done that, but his defence counsel should have asked the question, why? So the trial date got vacated and refixed for the 8th of January 2019. And a court-ordered psychiatric report was commissioned from Dr. Hayes. Now, Dr. Hayes had seen David on two previous occasions already, in 2004 and in 2011, both times in relation to nuisance phone calls. And he'd also seen him most recently in June of 2018. But Dr. Hayes interviewed David on the 31st of October 2018 and produced his report on the 20th of November. And here's, again, we need to pay close attention. I know I'm giving everyone lots of detail here, but because this is where you talk about the system failing here, Rachel, a moment ago.
Mhm.
So this is where the system falls over in a way that is genuinely hard to believe once you understand what happened. So Dr. Hayes, and you see the pattern here, it's time and time again. David's not innocent, but the system keeps failing him because Dr. Hayes had not even seen David's up-to-date medical records. He didn't know that in 2015 he'd suffered a traumatic brain injury. He didn't know about the skull fracture. He didn't know about subdural hemorrhage, subarachnoid hemorrhage, or the gliosis on the frontal lobe. He did not know that Dr. Shitty, consultant psychiatrist, had examined David in hospital just months earlier and formally diagnosed him with this executive syndrome. So Dr. Hayes was working without any of that information, and he
Essentially,
concluded that
he was working on his 2011 profile of
yeah.
David, wasn't he?
Exactly, yeah. And he concluded that David did not present as having any significant cognitive impairment, and that if any was present, it was unlikely to affect his fitness to plead and stand trial.
And how, might I ask, can he put his hand on the Bible and plead that he's telling the truth without all the facts? Who's let him down there, or has he let himself down?
Well, he wouldn't be able to, he wouldn't know. Oh, the doctor, you mean?
Yeah.
Because we'd never, yeah, I don't know, because I honestly don't know, Rach, to be honest with that one.
But I also
yeah.
think it depends how curious you are as a person, but, you know, you just second guess, like, before I stand in that box tomorrow, have I got all the facts and all the information?
So the report that he made went to Sheffield Crown Court on the 22nd of November 2018, and it got released to both sides, defence and prosecution. And on the strength of that report, the trial was allowed to proceed.
Wow.
So the Court of Appeal, years later, would note, and I'm almost quoting here, that Dr. Hayes' opinion would very likely have been completely different if he'd actually seen David's medical records or known about Dr. Shetty's assessment, but he didn't. Nobody made sure he did. And so David Wood, a man with a severe brain injury that nobody was telling the court about, was allowed to stand trial.
It's just not fair.
But you know what, Rach? This is why this is going to be a long episode. It gets worse.
Oh my God.
When the CPS raised concerns that there was no defence statement and David didn't appear to be cooperating with his own legal team. So this is the prosecution now raising concerns that there was no defence statement and that he wasn't cooperating with his own legal team.
How did the prosecution sleep at night?
Well, they did what they were supposed to do. They raised the concerns to the judge.
But you've got a vulnerable adult here. Come on. Surely you take one look at him and think.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So when they did that, the judge ordered the defence to file a defence case statement by noon on the 21st of December. So the defence did file one, but in it they wrote this. This is what they wrote. The defendant has had explained to him the warning regarding possible inferences, and it is not clear that he understands the warning. A usual defence case statement that can therefore not be served due to the very limited instructions, save to say the defendant has stated that he did not cause any fire. So David's own defence statement, when a judge ordered a defence case statement to be submitted in a formal court document, was effectively saying, we don't think our client understands what's happening here. We can't take proper instructions from him, and all we can say is that he denies starting a fire, and the trial was allowed to proceed anyway.
And that's an SOS, isn't it? At that point, again, another hurdle where someone goes, this is ridiculous, stop the process. This is clearly out of the ordinary case that cannot follow the diagram to proceed to court. It's giving me a headache.
Yes. Did you know we spoke about an intermediary for the trial?
Yeah.
So David's former solicitor has since said that the system did not give the legal team enough time to arrange for an intermediary for trial.
No.
And the judge decided that they would have to do without one. When they said that, the judge said you'd have to do without one. At the final mention hearing, the day before the trial started, defence counsel raised again the fact that there was still no intermediary report. The trial judge's view was that David, remember, a man with a brain injury, was insisting the trial. David himself was insisting the trial should go ahead, and so that with careful judge handling, the trial could just take place anyway. So the trial started, and I keep saying these things, and this has really got me worked up. This case, it gets worse, Rach. Can it get worse?
I don't see how.
I want to read you
might
something.
Have to finish the episode on your own at this rate.
I want to read you something here, everyone. On the first day of the trial, one of the jurors sent a note to the judge. One of the jurors actually wrote a note, handed it to the court, and this is exactly what the note said. I'm reading this word for word here. Sir, he's talking to the judge. Sir, I hope you do not find this premature or critical. I have immediate concerns over the mental capacity of the defendant based on his appearance, manner, behavior in the dock. Is the legal system or the mental health system more appropriate? Perhaps this will be addressed. Sorry if this offends, but it's an honest reflection. So one of the jurors, we'd only seen him on the very first day.
Day one.
Bear in mind, the judge had seen him several times, and one of the jurors said, this man can't stand trial.
Fucking hell. Sorry for my language. This is an absolute joke.
So let this land with you for a minute, everyone. This is a random member of the public. They'd been pulled off the jury panel to try a criminal case. They sat in court for less than a day, And they've looked across at David Wood in the dock and thought, something's not right here. This man shouldn't be on trial. He needs help, not a jury.
Jesus.
Now, what we
And the thing is as well, is he not threatening his own kind of position on that jury by speaking to the judge, because then he could be seen as a key influencer to sway the panel, couldn't he? At a later date. So he must have felt conflict and even writing that note, and thinking, how serious do I want to act on behalf of this gentleman? God, it's just awful.
and it's awful. And he carried on in the jury.
Oh, did he?
And what we know is that we don't know how the note was dealt with because the judge didn't record anything about the note.
Wow.
So the note had to be recorded into the trial proceedings because it was handed to a court official, handed to the judge. The judge didn't say anything or act on anything with the note.
Top tier judge here.
You can infer that the judge ignored it, but we don't know. But nothing
Yeah.
was officially recorded about the note. What we do know is that the trial continued. So the prosecution case was built on two things: the fire expert evidence, which established that the fire was started deliberately, and bad character evidence, the 38 nuisance calls, the attempted arson conviction from 2017, and the incident with Martin Ridge on the 1st of April. The prosecution argued that David had been reckless as to whether life would be endangered because, one, his neighbour was a 92-year-old woman with dementia who couldn't easily get out of her own home, and two, the houses were semi-detached so a fire could have obviously spread. And then David gave evidence in his own trial. So I want you to picture this. A man who can barely make himself understood at the best of times, who was diagnosed with a brain injury nobody at the trial knows about, who has executive syndrome that makes him confabulate, so say things he believes are real but are not, who his own defence team says doesn't fully understand what's happening around him. He doesn't know why he's in court. He doesn't understand what's happening. He's put in a witness box in front of a jury with no intermediary and asked to answer questions. So the Court of Appeal later listened to the audio recordings of his evidence. And what they found was multiple pauses, inaudible responses, and at least two occasions where the prosecuting barrister said out loud she couldn't understand the answer David had just given. He was asked very, very few questions in chief by his own side because there's very little he could say. So his own defence just didn't talk to him. He told the court he couldn't remember the fire. He couldn't remember being dragged out of the house. He didn't set the fire. He didn't know how it started.
And
He
this is the thing.
cross-examined it. So
The thing is, when he swears on the Bible as well, like, what's that worth to a man who, and I know that the jury don't understand, but the judge knows, and the defence and the prosecution know, that that man can't take that oath seriously because he isn't, in fact, aware of the impact of his own words and whether or not they're the truth.
in cross-examination, the prosecutor asked him about his previous conviction for attempted arson in 2017. David's answer was that he couldn't remember pleading guilty to it, and he didn't know whether he accepted he had done so. He couldn't even recall his own previous conviction, Rachel. And then there's this. The prosecutor put to him that if you set fire to one house that's attached to another house, it's obvious that the fire could spread. So the first time David was asked this, he gave either inaudible answers or kept repeating that he was concussed. David in the stand was telling right then, he said, I'm concussed. That was his mind trying to understand why his brain couldn't figure this out.
Oh my God.
But the prosecutor kept pushing, and eventually when it was put to him a final time that if you set fire to a house joined to another house, there's an obvious risk of it spreading, David said, and I'm going to quote here, he said, "Oh gosh." That's what he said, gosh. And then when the question was repeated again, he said, yeah. And a single word yeah from a man minutes earlier had given inaudible answers because he said he was concussed. He was treated as an admission that he understood the risk.
Crackers.
So on the 10th of January 2019, the jury convicted David Wood of arson, being reckless as to whether life was endangered. On the 7th of February 2019, he was declared a dangerous offender and sentenced to an extended sentence of 9 years, comprising of 6 years in custody and 3 years on extended license. On top of that, 11 months of his 2017 suspended sentence was activated and made to run consecutively. Now, David Wood, man who a juror had flagged as belonging in the mental health system, was now sent to prison. And that's where he would have stayed for a very long time if a fresh legal team hadn't eventually picked up his case and started asking some very serious questions about how any of this had been allowed to happen. But David went to prison. So he went to prison in February 2019. And for a while, nothing happened. He was given negative advice by his trial counsel about appealing. So he basically was told, you won't win an appeal, don't bother. But David didn't have a legal team by now. But acting on his own, he lodged an application for leave to appeal out of time in December 2019. So he drafted the grounds of appeal himself. And what followed was a genuinely sad paper trail. His application was initially treated as effective, and in 2020 he got reclassified as ineffective. So it's not clear whether anyone properly explained this to David. And even if they did, given what we now know about his condition, serious doubt he would have understood, because correspondence from 2020 and 2021 shows David writing into the Criminal Appeals Office under the impression that his appeal was still live. So in his head, he was still appealing his sentence, and he was still trying to clarify grounds about his appeal when his appeal had already been dismissed. So eventually, someone at the Criminal Appeals Office, they realised what was going on. The registrar granted David a representation order for a fresh set of solicitors, so he'd actually have a proper legal team and counsel to pick up the case properly.
Wow.
And they submitted new grounds of appeal in February 2024. And in June 2024, the single judge referred those grounds to the full court and crucially ordered a proper psychiatric assessment. And what
5
followed
years
over
too
the next
late.
year, and what followed up next year was effectively the medical assessment that should have happened back in 2018. The appeal was led by a consultant forensic psychiatrist called Dr. Medini, who assessed David in prison in August 2024. Dr. Medini produced a detailed report that went back through every medical record available. He noted that another consultant psychiatrist, a Dr. Kelly, had examined David in 2019 after his conviction and concluded he was suffering from what she called severe, enduring, and permanent brain syndrome, a chronic neuropsychiatric condition caused by his brain injury and his chronic alcoholism. And Dr. Medini agreed with that diagnosis.
Jeez.
Then came Dr. Watts, consultant neuropsychologist, who carried out a cognitive testing Dr. Hayes had never done back in 2018. He produced his report in May 2025, and then a third expert, a Dr. Shoney, another consultant forensic psychiatrist, assessed David in May 2025 as well. All three experts reached the same conclusion, independently, not speaking to each other. David's dysexecutive syndrome meant he was incapable of giving coherent instructions to his lawyers. He was incapable of giving evidence in his own defense. He almost certainly couldn't properly follow proceedings. And critically, all three of them said that these same problems would have applied in 2019. He wasn't fit trial to stand there, and he wasn't fit to stand trial now. So here's the thing then. Before David's appeal was even heard, something happened that made the point even sharper. David had been released on license in October 2024, so his appeal was going on, even though he'd already been released on license. And less than a week later, after he was released on license, he was arrested again for threatening to set his fire to his flat. He was recalled to prison, and a new trial was fixed for June 2025.
Right.
But when Dr. Medini and Dr. Shioni both assessed him as unfit to stand trial for that new charge, the Crown took one look at the medical evidence and in May 2025 announced they would offer no evidence, so the case was dropped. And that's a moment which really crystallizes it, because the Crown, the same institution that had put David on trial in 2019 and convicted him, was now looking at the same man with the same conditions and saying, no, actually, we can't try him. He isn't fit to stand trial.
Hallelujah.
And everyone agreed that he hadn't been fit to stand trial in 2019 either. So the Court of Appeal gets to April 2026. So as we're recording this month, Lady Justice Andrews, Mr. Justice Benafan, and His Honour Judge Lickley, KC, sit down with the evidence and reach a conclusion that, yes, David was under disability in 2019. He wasn't fit to stand trial. His conviction is therefore unsafe. But here's where it gets interesting, Rach.
Hang on.
The court also... Sorry.
Here's where it gets interesting.
Yes. The court also looks at all the evidence and says, actually, we're sure that he did start the fire. The expert evidence is overwhelming. He was locked inside the bungalow. He's the only person with the keys. The fire started exactly the same way he tried to start fires on previous occasions. The curtain over the back of the sofa lied to the method. And because 2 days earlier, Martin Midge had physically stopped him doing the same thing 3 times in 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So the conviction is by now quashed. So his license has also been quashed. But the finding is that David did the act that he was charged with. So it left the court with a decision to make. What on earth do you do with this man?
And I get it, right? The evidence is stacking up, right? And there is a case of him acknowledging at some point that he did start the fire as well and all that. But everyone up until that point has failed David. Everyone. So he has essentially been, other than somebody handing him the lighter and literally flicking it on, he's been allowed to start that fire. Because everyone has failed him in that run-up. He's been failed by social services in the instance where he fell, he had a severe head injury, and was allowed to continue to live by himself. He's been failed by the system that had him on license with a warning. And he then gets himself in trouble. This is 2 days before the fire starts. And the police have let him go again. Only then 48 hours later to have successfully set fire and turned himself into this farce of a court proceeding, and then to have sat in prison for 4 years before someone came along and said, this man needs a fresh set of eyes is needed on this case and this man needs some fucking help. Like at every point he's just been let down. Yes. So I get it, there's evidence to put him on trial and that he started the fire and that, you know, he should definitely have a criminal conviction. But there's also evidence to say that all of the systems that should be in place to prevent it getting to that stage should have done something to protect him before it got that bad.
Yes. So, under Section 6 of the Criminal Appeal Act 1968, when you quash a conviction on the grounds of disability, but find the defendant did the act, you've only got 3 options, Rachel. You've got a hospital order, a supervision order, or an absolute discharge. Now, option 1, the hospital order, it got ruled out straight away because although David's alcohol dependency is technically a recognised mental disorder under the Mental Health Act, it doesn't qualify him for detention in a hospital. And his brain damage, as serious as it is, it can't be treated. You can't undo a subdural hemorrhage from 2015. You can't reverse decades of alcohol damage to the frontal lobe. There's no medical treatment that's going to fix David, so a secure hospital placement isn't legally available, so that option gets taken off the table. He sees him with 2, supervision order or absolute discharge. A supervision order on paper sounds exactly like what you want. The court can require David to live somewhere specific, to engage with a probation officer or a social worker, potentially to engage with treatment, so he's got supervision, oversight and support. But there's one small problem, Rach. Under the law, the court cannot make a supervision order unless the supervising officer is willing to supervise. And neither the probation service nor Sheffield City Council were willing to supervise.
Why?
The probation service, through a probation officer called Jim Walkington, explained their position. David's compliance on licence in the past had been poor. So the probation service had no way to enforce a supervision order. They cannot sanction him for non-compliance. They can't recall him if the risk escalates. And given his history, he had significant concerns about being able to manage him at all. And Sheffield City Council, through Tim Gollins, the Assistant Director of Access, Mental Health and Wellbeing, says something equally problematic. David's social care assessment had concluded that he didn't have needs that justified a secure 24/7 residential placement. He had the capacity to make his own decisions about where he lived. The recommendation was for supported living, not secure accommodation. And critically, in any supported living placement, David could not legally be prevented from drinking alcohol. The council couldn't stop him going out to the shop and buying a bottle of vodka. And they also said, quite fairly, that adult social care isn't trained or equipped to manage criminal risk. So each of them pointed to each other. The probation service said City Council, and the City Council said the probation service. Each said the other was better placed. And while they argued about it, David still sat in prison. The court did eventually find a way forward. Sheffield City Council identified a supported living provider willing to take him on. probation agreed to initiate something called MAPA, the Multi-Agency Public Protection Arrangements, which brings together the police, probation, and social services to manage high-risk individuals in the community. It's normally given to sex offenders, MAPA, or people who have committed serious violence or murder. And it's not perfect. It's not a supervision order, but it is something. So what did the court actually do? Because they couldn't make hospital order, they couldn't make a supervision order because neither body would agree to supervise. So they had one option left, an absolute discharge, which meant David Wood, a man who the Court of Appeal itself had said did deliberately set fire to his own home in April 2018, a man two consultant psychiatrists agree is at a real risk of setting fire to something again, walked out of prison with no conviction, no sentence, no supervision order, and nothing on his record. He is in supported living now. He's being monitored through MAPA. Sheffield City Council is committed to supporting him in line with its statutory duties, nothing more. But everyone basically is holding their breath and hoping that wraparound support is enough. So I've talked a long time today, and I want to try and bring this one to a close, and then I'll ask you your opinion. Because this case, it's weird really, because we've talked about murders, we've talked about lots of horrible crimes, but this one's really stayed with me, even though the man is definitely guilty, in a way that not many do. David Wood is, by any measure, a man the system has failed at every single turn. As a child with a speech impediment, nobody properly supported him through. As a young man, when he turned to alcohol because it was the only thing that made his life feel manageable. As a middle-aged man who had a devastating fall in 2015 that changed his brain forever, and then went on to make 38 nuisance calls to the fire service without anybody stopping and asking what on earth was actually going on with him. He was failed by the rehabilitation activity requirement that got quietly removed in 2018. He was failed by the psychiatric report that didn't include his medical records. He was failed by the trial that went ahead without an intermediary. He was failed by the jury note that apparently went nowhere. Had he failed over and over again by a system that doesn't know what to do with people who are dangerous but not criminally responsible. But David isn't the only one that the system failed. There was a 92-year-old woman with dementia who was living next door on the 3rd of April 2018 who never quite knew how close she came to dying. There are firefighters who had to keep getting called out to the same address, wondering each time if this was the one where somebody would die. There's Martin Mage, who stopped 3 fires in 10 minutes, and nobody could have paid him enough for that. But then there's David himself. He's now living in supported accommodation in Sheffield, being managed by a system that is still genuinely just hoping for the best, because they can't force him to do anything. He'll still be drinking his vodka. So before I close in full, do you have anything? I know I've talked a lot at you here, Rach, but do you have anything that you want to add that you've not already mentioned about this man or the system in general?
No, I think I've been vocal enough throughout. Couldn't agree more with your summary. Everyone failed him. There are others that have been failed by the system that will be incredibly frustrated with the outcome as well, because no one's safe at the end of the day. No one is, and that's ultimately the reason why people are put through court, is to make sure that, the general public and people are safe. I actually thought at the start of the episode it would end in tragedy for the 92-year-old neighbour, so, I'm glad that wasn't the outcome, but it's been a tragedy for David and a really horrible case to listen to. Thank you, though. You did a great job of bringing it.
I should try to be emotive because I think it's important we let emotions in on this one, because David's not an innocent man. Not he had committed a crime, but he needs help.
Yeah.
So I'm going to wrap up here. If it's safe for you all to do so, I'd like you to relax. Close your eyes and picture the scene. A man in his armchair, man in an armchair, in a burning bungalow, a fire officer forcing open a door to save him for the 7th time. A jury member writing a note because something doesn't feel right. A court 7 years later, looking at all of it and finding that the only thing left on the statute book they can reach for is an absolute discharge. Justice isn't always a verdict. Sometimes it's just a recognition, years too late, that nobody was ever going to win this one. So thank you all for joining me today. It's been a heavy one, but it's been an important one, I think. And it's one that reminds me why we do this, Rach. If you've got thoughts, we'll find us on social media or on Spotify or YouTube. We'd love to hear them. Please do rate, review, and follow wherever you listen. It genuinely helps. So I've been Andrew.
And I'm Rachel.
And this has been Picture the Scene. and we're going to speak to you very soon. Goodbye.
Bye.